Content warning. After Hours is intended for a mature audience. This episode will include abuse, arachnophobia, body horror, blood, and gore. Listen at your own discretion. After Hours, Episode 4, A Mother's Love.
What the hell was that?
It sounded like a door slamming.
She really stayed behind just to play around with that old thing?
You don't think she actually opened it, right?
So what if she did? It's just a door, Bex. The worst thing it's going to do is give her a splinter. Then we'll get a headache from her whining.
God. Yeah, she has no pain tolerance. You remember that time she stubbed her toe?
And she swore she broke it? Most annoying trip to the emergency room ever. She's such a...
Such a what? No. Please do finish.
A crybaby.
Am not.
And that's where I cut in, or else you two will be am not and R2ing all night.
Only because Jules has the intelligence of a 2-year-old. Speaking of which, how was your diary entry?
It's not a diary, and you know it. But enough with that dumb door. Let's get on to the spiders. Count me in, Maddie.
What?
Oh, but I always count you in. You said my voice helped you slip into the zone.
And that I sound like a dying cat when I count, which still doesn't make any sense.
I know. I just thought we could switch it up for once. Something for the Patreon blooper reel, you know?
Sure. 1, 2, 3, action?
Hello once again, my lovely phantoms of the night. Becca, Maddie, and I are now on our third exhibit in our not entirely legal tour of the Salem Museum. This exhibit is known as the Webbed Widow, and as the name would suggest, this room is absolutely covered in cobwebs. On one side of the room, there's an old gilded book in a glass case, and on the other, there's a giant...
Jules!
What?
Aren't you forgetting something? Seriously? No content warning? You know, the one you always say in every episode that contains a major phobia?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I guess I just got a little too excited to talk about some creepy crawlies. Speaking of which, for any of my darling phantoms with arachnophobia, please consider skipping this next section as spiders will be heavily present throughout. Now, as I was saying, on the other side of the room is a giant web. In the center of the web is a wad of cobwebs with a massive spider post above it. Seriously, this thing is almost twice my size. I swear, if there's one thing this museum does right, it's their props.
I don't know. The human-sized spider feels a little overdone. Compared to the door and the coffin exhibit, this one feels a bit cliché.
Guess our writers team got burnt out.
Speaking of writing, for this exhibit we will be reading yet another personal journal. Though, unlike Adrienne's, this one is marketed as an autobiography. The book is titled Loving a Widow, and it was written by Lorelei Weber.
Wait, like the serial killer? The one who lured all the...
Spoilers!
Yes, like the serial killer, but we'll get into that later. This journal was written before her disappearance, and the Salem Museum apparently found the manuscript for the book after managing to get a search warrant for the Weber house. Which, honestly, I don't even want to know how they managed that. Notably, they did wait to create this exhibit and publish the book until after Weber had been declared deceased by the authorities. Lorelei Weber grew up a single child, and this book apparently addresses her complex relationship with her mother, who went missing a good 5 months before Weber herself did. If there's not any further comments, I say we jump right in. All right. There is no doubt in my mind that Ida Weber was born the most beautiful girl in the world. From auburn curls to amber eyes, Marilyn Monroe would have wept if she were to come face to face with her. She was clever, exceedingly so, and had quite the duplicitous nature hidden behind thick lashes and shy smiles. Her parents were wealthy, and like most wealthy individuals, enough was never enough. It was not enough for them to have a beautiful, bright daughter, one who would surely succeed in whatever career took her fancy. No, Ida Weber's parents needed their daughter to marry rich. So they scrounged the East Coast, looking for a man wealthier, more affluent than them. They eventually found what they were looking for in Johann Miller, eldest son of some old money family from New York. To call him a man is a stretch. Johann Miller resembled a human man in looks alone. His heart was a rotted home to mealworms, his soul was that of a bloodthirsty beast, and his mind was cruel and alien. He was a bulbous, corroded scourge upon the earth, upon all of creation, truthfully. Ida Weber's parents trussed her up in white and had her bind her life to this man for a few more pennies to eventually line their coffins with. It is in this story of Ida Weber being forced to marry someone she hates fully and vehemently that I find parents have a wondrous capacity for cruelty. It is in the rest of Ida's life that I find parents also have a wondrous capacity for love. If there is one thing I want anyone to gather from the story of my life, it is this. Ida Weber is a beautiful person, inside and out. It is my greatest envy that I never inherited any of her features.
All that for a mother she supposedly killed?
Seriously! Spoilers!
This isn't a movie, it's a
story! And you're jumping to conclusions. We're not even past the first chapter. Let's at least try and hear the girl out.
Alright.
Now, where were we? When I was a child, there was one thing that confounded me more than anything else. There is not a single picture of my mother smiling on her wedding day. In every single glossy framed photograph, her lips are thinly pressed and her brows are drawn in distress. If not for the white taffeta gown, you would think she was attending a funeral. I know now that those were not pictures of my mother's wedding, but in fact, her prison sentencing. The man, for to call him a husband is to make a mockery of the word itself, was a craven, vile thing. Any feelings of frustration, anger, sadness would be taken out on my mother. He was smart to cover her bruises with lavish clothes and jewelry, oscillating between beating her black and blue and showering her with anything his money could buy. Money could never buy my mother's love, however, something the man resented with every piece of his rotten soul. He would pin the blame on her, of course, insisting that they could be happy if only she would return his affections. My mother was a spiteful thing, and so she gave him the exact opposite. She retreated into herself and left him with nothing but an empty, icy shell for a wife, unable to love him, unable to fear him. This changed when I was born. My first memory is of my mother, staring down at me with nothing short of pure adoration, the kind of look a devout gives their God of choice. Love and joy and salvation all wrapped up in one. I was what cracked the icy exterior she took such pains to build. My mother loved me in a way she could love nothing else. She claimed that I was the one good thing the man gave her. I do not have any significant memories of him, and I know my mother is the cause of that. She shielded me from his cruelty, and as a result, my childhood was largely happy. I do have a few memories of bruises around my mother's wrist and ribs, but I had brushed them off with the typical ignorance of a child. We existed in this fragile balance, my mother shouldering the man's attention and him largely ignoring my existence for a good 5 or 6 years. Then he pushed her down the stairs. I remember standing over my mother's crumpled form. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the pure white bone poking out of her leg. It felt like a century before the man descended the stairs after her and took her to the hospital. She was bedridden for weeks after the incident, and with his usual target out of commission, the man turned his anger onto me. He refused to let me see my mother until she was healed. I remember the way she crept into my room the night the doctors took off her cast. She was so excited to see me. I had never seen her smile so wide. It was startling to see that smile shatter into a million pieces as her shaking fingers traced my battered, beaten face. Something broke in my mother that night. This was definitive proof. The moment she wasn't there to protect me, he had no qualms turning his fist to his daughter. After that night, I could tell my mother was planning something. She was more calloused than ever. Instead of coming back from beatings deflated or detached, she came back with blazing eyes and a straightened spine. There was a newfound steel in her. Our bedtime stories also took a sudden turn. People pleading to a higher power for protection, heroes searching for magical items to save their home. It's all obvious in retrospect when combined with my mother's other strange new habit. She was sending out letters. It wasn't that she didn't send out correspondences before, but it seemed like whatever time wasn't spent with me, she had her nose buried in a letter and her fingers stained with ink. She wrote frantically, desperately at times, as if the longer it took for her to write and send out her strange missives, the closer we got to some unforeseen threat. One day, when I was playing on the porch, the postman came by. He had a package from my mother. It was a thick, rectangular thing, wrapped in bland brown paper and carefully tied with a piece of twine. Being the responsible young lady that I was, I took the package off his hands and delivered it to my mother. Remembering it, it was almost like a dream. The package was unwieldy for my tiny body, and it took all of my strength to heave it from the porch to the sitting room. I remember calling out to my mother, the way her gaze snapped up from the letter she was writing, the way her ink-stained hands descended on the package and tore the wrapping in a frenzy, the reverence in her gaze, the unhindered joy on her face, the way she ran her fingers through my hair and requested, in a voice as smooth as velvet, that this package stay a secret between us. I remember linking pinkies with her before running off back to the porch, content to leave my mother with the strange old book she received in the mail. I completely forgot about the book after that. It would be years before I ever saw it again. What I did remember was that a few weeks after she received that package, she went out into the woods. I didn't see her go, of course. My mother was careful to protect me from any danger, not just the man. But I knew regardless. That night, she skipped our usual bedtime story. Instead, she tucked me in early, brushed back my hair, and kissed my forehead. Soon, she had whispered, soon all the monsters that plague us will be no more. Then she turned off the light, shut my door, and went into the woods. I woke up the next morning to my mother in the kitchen cooking breakfast. This wasn't unusual, but the police officers sitting at the table were. Their faces were a mix of pity and suspicion. My mother had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was a mess. The creak of a floorboard alerted them to my presence. My mother dropped the pan she was holding and descended upon me. Falling to her knees, she pulled me into her lap and wrapped her arms around me. I wrapped my arms around her in turn and swear I felt something in her back squirm. Her shoulders shook, and the noises she made sounded mournful, but I did not feel her shed a single tear. Over her shoulder, I watched as the officers' tense shoulders loosened and their stern countenances softened. They stood, and one placed his hand upon my mother's shoulder, promising to find the man. In a moment of childish insight, I guilelessly asked the officer where my father was. Never mind that I never once called the man father. It was clear to me that my mother and I were playing a game of pretend, a game where the man's disappearance would bring sorrow rather than delight. The officer's face tightened, as if he had been given something sour, and he awkwardly patted my head. "Not to worry, miss. We'll find your father soon enough." He was wrong, of course. Johann Miller would never be found. My mother made sure of that. The officers left, and the moment the front door slammed shut, my mother was scooping me up into her arms and spinning me about the room. She laughed, and I had never before realized just how much the man was weighing her down. We danced around the kitchen, pure unbridled glee spilling from her into me. The monster was gone, and it was never coming back. We were free to live lives full of love and laughter, hopes and dreams, where the biggest pains would be a scraped knee or a cut finger. And live our lives we did. Oh, what I would give for those halcyon days. In that grand manor at the end of the lane, my mother and I built a home. From the rotting remains of our lives with the man, we built something beautiful. Love and light and laughter. A blissful 4 years together. But all good things come to an end, even the ones you give everything to obtain. The man was wealthy, yes, but it was not enough to sustain ourselves indefinitely. My mother was terribly clever, yes, but did not have the marketable skills nor the knowledge necessary to pick up a career of her own. Very few people wanted to hire single mother widows. So, my mother began entertaining men once more. Despite the years that had passed, my mother was as lovely as ever, perhaps even lovelier now that the man wasn't around to hold her back. She had many would-be suitors approach her over the years, but she had denied each and every one of them. She had only just broken her chains. Why would she willingly shackle herself to another? At the time, I didn't understand it. Why would my mother allow this to happen? Surely she did not enjoy their lecherous eyes and wandering hands. Surely she did not enjoy the way they would belittle her at every turn. Surely she did not enjoy the way they treated me like a tool, a way to curry favor with her. Yet she permitted it all the same. Now, I know she was merely doing what she could to keep us afloat in a world hell-bent on putting us in the dirt. But such nuance is lost on most 10-year-olds, myself included. Eventually, she settled on Henry Dalton, a fairly rich, if not deeply unpleasant man who had a penchant for placing his hands where they were not welcomed. The two courted for a month, maybe 2, before they were wed. To any who asked, my mother claimed it was a whirlwind romance. Dalton filled the peace that Miller had left in her life and her home. Dalton left me alone well enough, and my mother was well versed in dealing with the amoral ways of men. We were not as jubilant as we had once been, but we were also not as miserable. Eventually, though, my mother began to tire of Dalton, or tire of being his wife, simpering to a pompous, oily man who wasn't worth the air he breathed. It all came to a head one day during lunch. Dalton rarely turned his watery gaze to me, but on this summer afternoon, he did. I remember how in that moment I was unable to figure out if his eyes were blue or gray, and rather than finding it magical, I just found it weak. How difficult is it, I thought, to pick an eye color and stick with it? My own musings aside, Dalton began to, in a completely unprecedented manner, demand that I call him father. His words were quickly met by my mother's melodic laughter. She stood in the kitchen, shoulders shaking with the force of her amusement. She laughed for so long and so hard she was gasping for breath by the end of it. It's a miracle she didn't drop the plate she was holding. Dalton's face had flushed with indignation. "What are you laughing at? You should be ashamed of your brat's behavior. How disgusting for your child to refuse to acknowledge your husband," he growled at her, which only sparked my mother's laughter anew. It was as lovely as always, though there was an odd, chittering tone to it now. By the end of her fit, she smiled sweetly at Dalton. "Let us shelve the matter till tonight, darling," my mother insisted. There was a curl of amusement to her smile, as if there was a joke there that no one but her understood. That night, after my mother tucked me into bed, I asked her if I should be calling Dalton father. She was married to him after all, and I didn't wish to upset her if she truly loved him. My mother brushed aside my concern with an inelegant snort. "Fret not, dove. Mr. Dalton won't be making such foolish demands much longer." I never saw Dalton again after that night. The police were more suspicious this time, but there was no crime scene to be investigated. My mother and I were free once more and freshly flushed with cash. This seemed to spell another 6 blissful years for us. And yet she immediately welcomed suitors back into our home once her mourning veil had been set aside. This cycle went on for some years. Mother would meet, court, and marry a wealthy man, and at some indecipherable point she would tuck me into bed, promising he would not be a nuisance for much longer, and the next morning the man would be gone. The gaps between her weddings grew shorter and shorter over time, but never enough to become suspicious. "A string of bad luck," others would murmur. "A dreadfully lonely woman," they lamented. But they didn't realize my mother had me, and that was quite enough for the both of us. It was around the 4th husband that my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know where the men went after my mother promised to banish them from our lives. The routine that night was the same as all the others. Some time after the sun dipped past the horizon, my mother ushered me to bed. She took care to tuck my comforter around me, a shield from any monsters lurking in the shadows of my room. Then she smoothed my hair back from my head and placed a kiss upon my brow. "Dream of the sky, my dove, vast and free, for that is where our tomorrow shall be." Then she crept away, mindful of my door's creaky hinges, and left me to drift peacefully off to sleep. Or at least, that's what I would have normally done, had I not resolved myself to discovering my mother's secret. Instead, I waited for the house to grow still and silent, and then a little bit after that. My mother was clever. There was no world in which she allowed any chance of me still being awake on nights like these, which meant she would wait, bide her time until she was sure I was safely out of harm's way. Eventually, I grew tired of waiting and figured my mother must have as well. I threw off my blankets, crept to the door, and slowly pulled it open. The hinges made the barest hint of a squeal, and I could only pray it was quiet enough to avoid garnering my mother's interest. I inched my way down the hall to my mother's room. It was only a few feet at most, but it felt like miles. My lungs ached. I couldn't make myself breathe properly for fear of being caught. I knew that, logically, my mother would never hurt me, not like the man had, but that wouldn't make her disappointment sting any less. I couldn't stand upsetting her, and I knew that finding me awake on a night like this would upset her more than anything. Finally, I reached her door. It was shut, undoubtedly locked, and I was struck with the sudden realization that I had no idea what to do. It wasn't like I could just open the door. I didn't even know for sure what my mother would be doing. There were never any bodies when she was done. Who's to say it would even be happening in the house? Just when I started to lose hope, I heard the muffled sound of voices through the door. I moved to press my ear against the wood when the handle suddenly caught my eye. The door to my mother's room was old. It was a classical dark wood with an ornate brass handle that required a pretty key to lock it. A key that fit into a particularly large keyhole. A keyhole that was just large enough to peek through once you got close enough. Huddling close to the door, I shut one eye and leaned in close to the keyhole. My mother's back was to the door. Her newest husband, whose name I never bothered to learn, was yelling at her. I didn't have the chance to make out the words before he slapped her, her head snapping to the side with the force of it. The man continued to yell, but my mother did not turn her head back towards him. She stood, still and silent, with her hair obstructing her face. Then her shoulders squared and something began moving in her back. At first I thought it was her gathering her strength, but then I realized there was nothing in her back that could twist and writhe like that. There was no muscle nor bone that could squirm like whatever was in my mother's back did. It pushed against her skin, distending her back more and more. I nearly cried out before it suddenly broke through her skin with a wet snap. Blood-soaked and twitching, long, sinuous limbs began to emerge from my mother's back. 1, then 2, 4, then 6, 8. Spiders' legs pulled themselves from her ruined, mutilated flesh. Her head whipped around to face the man, and that chittering noise that I had heard in her laughter so long ago filled the room. The legs spasmed, arching around her like a halo before they descended upon the man. He screamed, and the wet noises of flesh tearing and bones breaking rose above the chittering. My mother fell to her knees and began ripping into the man with earnest. The screams began to taper off, and in their absence came a cracking, damp noise. Her actions grew frenzied, and I was struck with the realization that she was eating the man. The wet noise was his flesh ripped and chewed from his body, the cracking noise his bones snapped to pieces and marrow sucked from their centers. On all fours, my mother consumed her husband like a wild, feral animal, ate him until there was nothing but bones left, and then ground those bones to dust. No body to be found. I needed to get back to my room. I took a frantic step back, and the floor creaked beneath my weight. Loud as a thunderclap, clear as a bell, undeniable as a death sentence. I stood back, frozen, and listened as my mother took 4 even steps across the room. The hinges squealed softly as she pulled open the door. Her shadow seemed to loom so large in the doorway, her new limbs twitching and convulsing behind her. Her fine nightgown was drenched in blood. I could hear droplets of it hitting the floor below her. But I could not bring myself to check, for that would mean tearing my gaze away from her face, from her 8 glossy, bloodshot eyes, from the mandibles that pushed themselves from her mouth. We stood in silence, something delicate resting between us. I will not lie. I was horrified. I was terrified of a beast that could slaughter a man and consume him within minutes. I wanted to run as far as I could from the room and the thing in its doorway. Then I remembered that the man had slapped my beloved mother, had belittled and berated her since they were wed all those months ago. He was cruel. He was not entirely undeserving of his fate. I remembered that what stood in the doorway was not a beast but my mother, my beautiful, kind mother, who would tuck me in each night and do my hair each morning and shield me from years of pain, who loved me despite the fact that I shared a face with her abuser. His eyes and hair and nose were all the same as my own, and she adored them regardless. My mother loved me, of that I am sure. So I swallowed my fear and trusted in her love. It was scary in my room. Can I sleep with you tonight? My mother crooned in reply, sweeping me into the room with a chitter. I crawled into the bed, avoiding what was left of the man on the floor. The sheets were blessedly free of blood, and so too was my mother after a trip to the bathroom. The moment she slipped under the covers, I was curling up in her embrace. Her fingers threaded slowly through my hair, and the last of my tension melted away. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I felt her 8 legs slowly wrap around me, fully cocooning me in her embrace. The message was clear. I had no need to fear this monstrous form, for my mother would always protect me. From that point on, my mother didn't hide anything from me. The chitter in her laughter, the spider's legs squirming under her skin, the clicking mandibles tucked into her jaw, they became a new constant, a new normal. Now, when she tucked me into bed and promised her latest husband would no longer be a nuisance, we shared a smile. A dark, glassy eye would open on her cheek, skin splitting with a soft squelch, and wink playfully at me. A secret between mother and daughter. It was fun, and maybe that's a cruel thing to say, to find joy in my mother's murderous tendencies, but I didn't care much at the time. I still don't. We were happy, and that's all that ever mattered. Over time, however, things with my mother began to get strange. It used to be that there would be months between her husbands. It used to be that by morning there wasn't a hint of my mother's transformation. But as time passed, these things became less and less true. There were mornings where my mother's voice would be more clicks than words, where she would have 3, 4, 6, 7 eyes scattered around her lovely face, where there would be 8 twitching legs sprouting from her back despite how desperately she tried to shove them back beneath her skin. It got to the point where we had to wait days before informing the police of her husband's disappearance. The last thing they needed was to see my mother in any sort of monstrous state. The time between her husbands seemed to only grow shorter and shorter as the time it took for her to change back took longer and longer. A sort of grimness overfell my mother even as she continued to lure men into our life. It got to the point that she wasn't even waiting to marry them. All it took was one night in the house and they were gone. She faced it all with a sort of gallows humor, though she refused to tell me what was wrong. She would insist that it was for money, but I knew that couldn't be true. We were rich beyond comparison. My mother's 12 or so dead husbands had lined our coffers quite thoroughly. I knew it couldn't be about money. I knew it. But she refused to admit the truth. It was the first time we ever truly fought. At the time, I was just so angry. She knew I loved her. She knew I didn't care. So why was she keeping secrets from me? Why now, of all times, when everything seemed to be going sour? Now, I know it was because she knew I loved her. She wasn't lying because she didn't trust me. She was lying because she had no desire to break my heart. But no matter how much my mother tried to protect me, some things are inevitable. It was a warm spring afternoon when she finally told me. We were sat on the porch, my mother in her favorite rocking chair, and me sprawled out at her feet. My skirts were grass-stained and my fingers were sticky from the daisy chain I was weaving. Lorelei, I remember her sighing, as if the word took a great effort to expel. I need to be honest with you. A snarky remark was on the tip of my tongue, but it died as I caught the glimmer of tears in my mother's eyes. My mother looked grief-stricken in a way I'd never seen before. I sat up, resting my head on her knee. A shaky hand weaved its way through my hair, and another sigh slipped out of my mother. I'm changing. Permanently. Each transformation has hurt more and more, and I can feel it. One of these days, I won't be able to change back. Then just stop changing. We don't need more money, and they all make you miserable anyway, I offered, naive and angry and so stupid. My mother crooned, that same spider-like croon she gave me the night I caught her. I wish I could, my dove, but it's not so simple. I'm hungry. If I do not transform and eat, I will starve. So if you keep transforming, you eventually won't be able to come back, but if you stop transforming, you'll die. Yes, she said, and that's all I heard before I began to sob. My mother was dying. My mother, the person who loved me most in the world, who raised me, who protected me. She was leaving me behind, and with my face shoved into her knees, I've never felt so small. I was still just a child. The world was so large and dangerous, and the one person who was meant to care for me was leaving me behind. I wanted to scream and rage against it. What was the point of life, of living, if everything you love is inevitably stolen from you? What was the purpose of all this suffering if your brief slivers of joy would only be ripped from you, no matter how white-knuckled your grip? It took me a long time to calm down after that. I felt like a hollowed-out shell. It was hard, so desperately difficult to not mourn someone who wasn't yet dead. My mother did her best to comfort me, but I knew she was scared too. We clung to each other tightly in those last few weeks. Terrified and so full of love, we ached. She made all my favorite foods and braided my hair every morning. I played her favorite songs on the piano and told her all about the schoolyard gossip I had heard that day. We did all the things we would miss, getting our fill of each other before the inevitable came. And come it did. In the dead of night after my mother had finished her latest meal. I was the one who had to invite him over this time. Her mandibles had refused to retract, and the skin of her back was constantly distended from the limbs desperate to escape her flesh. She was in no state to be luring in flies. It was in the dead of night, and I was sleeping fitfully in my bed. Something fuzzy brushed across my cheek, and I rolled over, coming face to face with 8 glossy black eyes. It loomed over me, long legs bent so its massive face may rest close to mine. Its bulbous body was blood-soaked and twitching, mandibles clicking loudly in the silence of my room. It was a massive spider. There was no hint of auburn curls or amber eyes, no charming smile or gentle hands. Ida Weber was gone, dead and consumed by the monster that lurked under her skin. My mother was dead, and all that was left was this empty, murderous shell. I wrapped my arms around the spider's head and wailed. I went a bit mad in the days following my mother's death. I was like a ghost, listless, lifeless, and constantly crying. My mother was confined to her bedroom. At some point, I had decided that even if the spider held none of my mother's memories, none of her love or compassion, it was still my mother. It wasn't all that different from regular families, I reasoned. Parents eventually grow old, and it is up to their children to care for them. It was my job to care for my mother now, to protect her as she protected me. I had to care for her, and that meant getting her food. I was a bit young to be wed, so my school friends would have to do. There was no one else I could easily convince to come to my house. The first was Ellie Kensington. She was sweet, if a bit dull, and didn't hesitate to accept my invitation to spend the night. I didn't realize how strong her lungs were. She screamed for at least an hour after I led her to my mother's room. The next was Charles. Ellie had mentioned him having a crush on me. I personally found him a bit repulsive, but it was simple enough work convincing him to come over. Then there was Michael, or perhaps Diane. Michelle had come after, then Lucas, Peter, the man from the general store. I fed a good dozen or so people to my mother before people started getting suspicious. On the rare occasions that I left the house, people would eye me, and I heard whispers of a police investigation. People didn't want to follow me home anymore. Instead, they asked where my mother was, when the last time I saw Ellie was. The flies were clever, and I was a novice. I didn't know how to weave a web as intricately as my mother did. Nearly 2 decades of killing, and she was never once caught. I was flying blind without her. I'd never felt so lost in my life. No one would come to the house, and my mother was starving. I could hear her crooning and clicking and scratching at the walls. She was hungry. My mother was hungry, and I was supposed to protect her. I was supposed to care for her, and I was failing. She needed food. She needed a person to eat, but there was no one to give her. Except, well, that's a lie. There is someone who could feed her. My mother needs food. She needs flesh and blood and bone. It would be selfish of me to deny her what she needs when I have it all. I do not need my body, not as much as she does. It's only right, isn't it? She birthed me. My flesh grew from her flesh, my bone from her bone. She nourished me with her body, so it's only right to nourish her with my own. My mother protected me, kept my blood from being spilled, kept my bones from breaking and my flesh from splitting. My mother has loved me so much. Should I not repay all that love in return which she gave me? No one else will enter the house. I will not allow my mother to starve. I know what the town says, what they will say after this. That is why I wrote this story, in the hopes that someone may understand the truth. So, dear reader, I would like to leave you with this message. Ida Weber is the most beautiful woman alive, inside and out. I love her, always and forever. Well, that was something.
Jesus Christ, Jules. What the hell was that?
I have no goddamn idea.
I mean, the story mostly matches what I know about the Lorelei Weber case. Though the official story is that she murdered her mother in a bout of hysteria before going on a killing spree and eventually killing herself in her dead mother's room.
Now, I do wonder what was up with that book.
Seriously, Jules?
What? This is a clear case of hysteria and insanity. This whole story is just the ramblings of a madwoman, but there has to be some merit to it. So what was up with the book? Is it the same one that's in the case over here?
Is the spider in here stuffed? Did the museum stuff Ida Weber and prop her up like some cheap Halloween prop?
There's no way. Besides, even if it is real, then what's up with that wad of webs the spider is hunched over?
I think I can see something blue inside there.
Oh, that must be Lorelei. Her mother probably didn't want to eat her, even as a spider, so she preserved her child the best she could. It's kind of sweet when you think about it.
Oh my god, I'm gonna be sick.
It's not real. God, Jules, what has gotten into you? You know how much this stuff freaks out Rebecca. You don't even believe in this crap. This is just the museum taking the ramblings of a murderous teenager and turning it into a horror story. End of story.
Hey, Maddie.
No. Madeline is right. Sorry, Becca. I guess I got a bit ahead of myself.
It's alright, Jules. I know you didn't mean to. How about we just move on to the next exhibit?
You go ahead, Becca. Julia and I need to talk.
Oh, go on ahead, Queenie. We won't be long.
Okay.
All right, Maberry. What the hell is going on? You haven't been acting like yourself since the door. What? Why are you staring at me like that?
Well, I'm trying to decide just how much trouble it'll be to kill you.
What? This isn't funny.
See, Rebecca is so fond of Julia, she's willing to overlook my slip-ups. But you, no, you see too much. Not even 5 minutes in and you already picked up on things I was doing wrong. You're a liability.
What are you talking about?
Aw, don't you get it? I'm not Julia. Have fun in the restricted hall, Mads. Give the miracle mask and the arsonist key my love.
Julia? Julia! Hello? Julia! Rebecca? Help! Julia Maberry, you bitch!